Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alan Matisow, Associate Director of the Baker Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome everybody to tonight's special event. Some 20 years ago, when Ambassador Dirigian began the Baker Institute, he had a problem, and that problem was how to distinguish this think tank from the other 1,500 think tanks in the United States. And he decided that the way to do that was to emphasize comparative advantage. And we have tried to do that over the years. 4 of our programs in particular have exploited our comparative advantage and have been graduated to the status of centers. We are in Houston, which is the energy capital of the United States, so we have a Center for Energy Studies. We're across the street from a great medical center, so we have a Center for Health and Biosciences. We have a lot of strength on the campus in the Middle East, including James A. Baker III, who was Secretary of State, and our director, who was ambassador to Israel and Syria, as well as Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East. And so we have a center for the Middle East, and we have a Mexico Center. The director of that, Tony Payan, he was born in Parral, Chihuahua, got his degrees at the University of Dallas, his BA and his MBA, and he got a PhD from Georgetown International Studies in 2001. During his tenure at the University of Texas at El Paso, he wrote a number of very important books and articles focusing on U.S.-Mexican relations with particular emphasis on the border. So in 2012, when we were looking for a scholar to study immigration issues, we invited him to visit for a year, which he did. He did well, so well that in 2013, he became the first Francoise and Edward Dirigian Fellow in Middle Eastern Studies at the Baker Institute and the first director of the Mexico Center. The amazing thing about this center is that in 2 years, it has already become an important player on U.S.-Mexico public policy issues, mainly, I think, because of Tony's leadership. Because of funds we've been able to raise, we will be bringing on to the center as a full-time resident fellow next month, an expert on Mexican energy issues, and we are in the process of recruiting somebody in trade economics. We also have a number of non-resident fellows. By my count, there are now 8 of them. They're distinguished Mexicans and Americans. They're from academia, they're from business, they're also from government. They do research for us, they write issue briefs for us, they advise us. Here is a bit of advice. If you are interested in Mexican issues, you could go on our website and become a real fast, quick study. There's a remarkable array of very interesting and readable articles on our website. We're also trying to engage on some of the most important contemporary events, developments in Mexico in recent years. The Mexico Center is a convener and a coordinator in a project that involves important institutions both in the United States and Mexico called the Rule of Law and Mexican Energy Reform. We're trying to do the same thing in a project, again, involving important institutions on both sides of the border, which will be called Unbinding Mexico's Telecommunications Sector. We also give very interesting and important conferences. The next one actually is on Thursday, May the 21st. And it will be called Brain Drain or Brain Circulation. Turns out that there's about 73,000 Mexicans with PhDs, of whom 20,000 work in the United States. So the conference will be interested in why is that? And is that really such a bad thing? So if you're interested in that subject, you might want to come by on Thursday. We do something else here at the Baker Institute. We and the Mexico Center bring in major speakers from Mexico to help educate American audiences. We've had the Mexican foreign minister, we've had the CEO of Pemex, and today we have one of the most distinguished political figures in the recent history of Mexico, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. He will be introduced by the first director of the Mexico Center at the Baker Institute, Tony Payan.
Thank you very much, Alan, for your kind words. And indeed, we hope to make this the best Mexico Center in the United States to understand and think about Mexico and the binational relationship. And I think we're well on our way thanks to the support of Secretary Baker, Ambassador to Region, and of course, Alan and our colleagues and friends at the Baker Institute. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce to you, as Alan said, one of the most important political figures of recent Mexican history, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas Solórzano. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas currently serves as the president of the Centro Lázaro Cárdenas y Amalia Solórzano and of the Fundación para la Democracia. A prominent Mexican politician, he is former leader and founding member of Mexico's Party of the Democratic Revolution, PRD. From 2003 to 2008, he was the vice president of Socialist International and was named honorary president of the organization in 2008. He served as mayor of Mexico City from 1997 to 1999. He has been a presidential candidate on various occasions, representing the Frente Democrático Nacional in 1987, the PRD in 1983, and the Alianza por México coalition in 1999. He served as a senator for the state of Michoacán from 1976 to 1982, and then as governor from 1980 to 1986. Cárdenas was a member of the Corriente Democrática, the democratic current of the party of the Institutional Revolution, PRI, which aimed for greater transparency in the party's presidential nomination process. He was a member of the National Committee of the Movimiento de Liberación Nacional, the National Liberation Movement, from 1961 to 1965, and president of the Advisory Committee of the Confederación Nacional Campesina, the National Confederation of Peasants, from 1967 to 1968. Cárdenas has taught at the University of Notre Dame, the University of Chicago, and the University of California at Berkeley. He holds a degree in civil engineering from the Escuela Nacional de Ingenieros, now the Faculty of Engineering at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, UNAM. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Ingeniero Cárdenas. Please, come in. Thank you.
Dear friends in this Rice University's Baker Institute Mexico Center, I am highly honored by Rice University's Baker Institute Mexico Center's invitation to be before you this afternoon. I thank you for this very important opportunity for me. I shall be talking about the state of Mexican democracy just a few weeks before June the 7th, when Mexico will have the midterm federal election, in which our Chamber of Representatives, Cámara de Diputados, will be renovated. The same day elections for municipal authorities will take place in 17 states, and in 9 of those also elections for state governors. democracy, and more specifically, the respect of the vote, became a conscious collective political demand in the first years of the 20th century, during a hard dictatorship which lasted for over 30 years. In 1908, President Porfirio Díaz, who was in his sixth term, declared to James Creelman, an American journalist, Mexico was mature for democracy. This declaration gave expectations Díaz would not run for election. When he finally decided to run for a seventh term in 1910, an important anti-re-election movement emerged, headed by Francisco Madero. Madero was imprisoned under false charges and thus prevented from participating in the election. But during his imprisonment in San Luis Potosí, from which he escaped, he sent a manifesto calling for rebellion to break on November 20th, 1910 at 6 p.m. sharp. On that date, when the revolution broke, Madero was in San Antonio, Texas. Before these events took place on July, Díaz was reelected for his seventh term. In September, he presided celebrations of the centennial of Mexico's independence. His presidency was seen as strongest as ever, and the whole world thought he would stay in power at least till the end of his seventh term in 1916, when he would be 86. On November 20, the revolution broke. Díaz resigned a few months after and left Mexico on May 1911. A provisional government took office and called for elections. Madero was elected president in the up to now considered Mexico's fairest election ever, and took office in December 1911. Madero's government was in permanent conflict, on the one hand with different revolutionary groups, on the other with the Porfirian army and political elite, which maintained important political and economic positions. Military and politicians from old regime, pushed and backed by the American ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, gave a coup on February 1913. Madero and his vice president were assassinated, and armed struggle broke again all around the country. The usurper government fell, but the different revolutionary groups continued fighting among them. Constitutionalists, one of the fractions, imposed over the other fractions. In 1917, a new constitution was promulgated, which for the first time included social rights. President Carranza, who was the head of the Constitutionalists, tried to impose a civilian as president against the majority of the army, whose candidate was triumphant General Álvaro Obregón. Most of the army rebelled, Carranza was assassinated, a provisional government called for elections, and Obregón took office for the term 1920-1924. Succession in the presidency, even if legal elections were held, provoked unsuccessful rebellions in 1924 and 1928. And from 1934 on, the transfer of the presidency has been through peaceful means. For a long period, the so-considered revolutionary governments gave much more attention to promoting and enhancing social democracy, that is, agrarian reform, workers' rights, social security, popular housing, than to electoral democracy, which I must say, ups and downs. Social and economic conditions, which had been slowly but continuously improving since the early 30s, deteriorated very rapidly for a vast majority of the population beginning the 80s. From 1930 to 1980, the gross product grew at an annual rate of 6%. From the 80s up to now, gross product has increased around 2% annually, with serious falls in 1995 and 2009 of around -6 to 7%. On September 19th, 1985, a very hard earthquake struck Mexico City, destroying large areas of the city and leaving thousands of victims and thousands homeless. This blow aggravated the negative effects of neoliberal policies already affecting large sectors of the population. At the earthquake's stroke, the government paralyzed, not knowing what to do for about 2 days. This may seem a very short period, but it was too long for the people who were in need. People with their own means began to organize the rescue. The needs of reconstruction and the government's slow reaction made people aware a more intense and active social mobilization was necessary to put pressure on the government so people could be heard and their main needs could be met. As a side effect of this situation, by the end of 1986, a movement within the official party, the PRI, came into being, the Democratic Current, which demanded, in the first place, policies with the capacity to stop deterioration and improve social conditions, that's income, jobs, and better education, and second, that the party implemented democratic procedures to select its candidates. This second demand led the Democratic Current to a direct confrontation with the PRI, the government, and finally with the president. The Democratic Current was contesting the president's non-written, non-constitutional, but in a way generally accepted within the regime, right to select his successor, a real and serious political sin. The presidential term, with no possibility of re-election, was to end in December 1988. The Current demanded a primary, a demand never accepted. When the president selected the pre-candidate in October 1987, the Democratic Current left the party. Now I have to say some words about my personal participation in those days' political events. The Democratic Current had proposed me to run within the PRI's primary. If it were to vacant vote, days before the PRI announced its candidate, small opposition parties approached us in the Current, offering me their presidential candidacy. After serious collective considerations on which could be the right decision, it was decided I should accept to be the candidate of the 3 parties which had invited me to represent them. So I became the candidate of 3 political parties and several social organizations. By the end of the campaign, the candidate of a 4th party declined and brought his and his party's support to my candidacy. The election was a major electoral fraud, recognized as such not only by a large majority of public opinion, but also, some years later, by the then President de la Madrid in his published autobiography. The campaign led by the Democratic Current as part of a vast coalition, the Democratic Front, provoked a very intense and enthusiastic social mobilization unseen in previous campaigns. An important fact proving the fraud is that in 45 of the voting sections, 25,000 out of 55,000, figures on the voting were never made public. On election day, when there was a perception the PRI was losing, the President ordered the Minister of Government to give electoral information, not party by party and candidate by candidate in every section, but aggregated, whatever this means, by district. So electoral results had to be invented for the votes of 45% of the sections scattered over the 300 districts in which the country is divided, if counted, were never officially recognized or made public party by party and candidate by candidate. The Democratic Front went through every legal research to reverse fraud. Large demonstrations took place in the most important cities of the country. The Chamber of Deputies, at that time the electoral authority, recognized the official outcome and fraud finally imposed. But in this talk, the important fact is that the 1988 fraud as a reaction provoked a collective consciousness that participating and voting opened the possibility of effective change. Fraud continued to be the usual practice in state and municipal elections, but people kept participating and voting, with protests and conflicts more or less intensive after every process. The government had to recognize partial triumphs of the opposition in state and municipal elections. This was the beginning of the opening. In 1995, a serious economic fall occurred. Economy decreased around -7%, with grave social consequences. Political and social unrest manifested strongly. The government, to overcome this situation, as escape valve, gave autonomy to the electoral authority, making it independent from the federal government, and opened the possibility of electing Mexico City's mayor for the first time in our history, coinciding with the midterm chamber election of representatives in 1997. It's important to note, for the first time during the campaigns of 1997, television and radio opened to opposition parties and candidates, which had not been the case in previous elections. The outcome of this election was opposition winning Mexico City, the mayor and the majority of the local assembly, and the PRI losing for the first time absolute majority, 50% plus one, and the chamber's national representation. In every following election, there haven't been, both in the Senate and the chamber, absolute majorities. We may say that after the 1997 election, the quality of our elections improved. Votes have been correctly counted, even if there have been serious protests for the interference of high-ranked officials to influence results, the president himself in 2006, and dirty or illegal money has been denounced in federal processes of 2006 and 2012, and in other state and municipal elections. But even if our electoral democracy has improved, important corrections have still to be made. And on the other hand, I have to say Mexico has been going backwards in its social democracy since neoliberalism was imposed. In what conditions will Mexico arrive to the next midterm election? Over 50% of the population is under the poverty line. 25% of total population suffers elementary poverty. Officially, unemployment measured through a poll, a method used only in Mexico, affects from 5 to 6% of active population. Reality shows this figure increases to around 50%. Hundreds of thousands of migrants in an irregular condition continue to flow to the United States. The rate of economic growth is around 2% of the gross domestic product. Large and important economic sectors have drastically reduced or disappeared. Internal markets have been left to foreign producers. Violence has expanded all over the country. Organized crime controls vast territories. Institutional discredit is general. Supreme Court, the Congress, political parties, business organizations, judicial system, police, the executive, as is discredit of the highest ranked officials who are considered by public opinion to have no moral authority. My guess in this election, even if 10 parties are participating, 3 of them for the first time, is that the new Chamber of Representatives will have a very similar composition to the present one, the PRI and PAN fractions being the most important, though none as an absolute majority. But regardless of how the new Congress is integrated, what Mexico urgently needs is a profound change in its social and economic policies, as well as in the policies implemented to combat organized crime and drug trafficking. Mexico's present generations were born and have known but crisis. But we must accept crisis is not necessarily eternal. Change may take place if things are done as they should be done. Since the early 80s, Mexico has been a diligent and disciplined pupil of neoliberal policies, of the Washington Consensus. No administration in all these years has dared to implement anti-cyclical economic policies. Results have been, as I said before, negative in every aspect. Other countries in South America, for example, also struck by crisis provoked by neoliberal policies, have made strong changes in their state policies, and social and economic conditions have undoubtedly improved in Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, and Mexico, who could have done more or less the same. The only way I foresee to bring on a change in Mexico's state policies is an effort, a hard effort, to make democratic and progressive organizations and individuals to promote and work around the common goals. The first step in this regard, I think, is to elaborate a proposal which may become a unifying element for political organization and social mobilization. This proposal, to be successful, should be built through a plural participation conducted all around the country among political groups in universities with civil organizations, political parties, etc. The discussion and formulation of a comprehensive proposal that may be put into practice with the wide social support is, on my point of view, the main priority for Mexican democracy. A small group, I could call it a nucleus, with this objective on mind has started to work. We, I am one of the promoters, are at the very beginning and we are optimistic. We hold a policy of sustained economic growth is possible, as are possible policies for a fairer distribution of income, better wages, formal new jobs, a wider system of social security, fair international relationships with every country. New policies to combat organized crime are also possible to design and implement. Crime, and specifically drug trafficking, is not an isolated phenomenon. Solutions have to consider direct confrontation. At the same time, the complex relationship and necessary coordination with policies related to education, opportunities for youth, employment, increasing wages and income, health policies, money laundering and the flows of drug money, international relations, particularly with the United States, and the implementation of these policies coordinated and simultaneously. The improvement of living standards and equality and opportunities are in the roots of any real and effective solution. I firmly believe politically, socially, and economically it is possible. I want to thank once more Rice University's Baker Institute Mexico Center for this invitation. It really honors me. Thank you.
Well, in the spirit of continuing this conversation, I have some questions, and then we'll open it to Q&A from you all so that you can begin to prepare your questions. There's a couple of microphones on either end, or the aisles over here to my left and right, and so I'll let you know when we'll begin the open Q&A. But I want to follow up on some of the things that you have said, Mr. Cárdenas. So tell me, what is the general mood of Mexican citizens going into this election? Do you expect a lot of abstentionism? Do you expect people's participation? Is there a new animus from Mexicans to go to the polls in the middle class and to come back? Or do you see a rather large defection from the polls? And what does that mean for the legitimacy of the 2015 elections?
I think abstentionism will be high, as has been high in every midterm election. But maybe this time we will have a smaller participation in the federal election. Maybe in those states where governorship or municipal authorities are also to be elected, we may have a little higher participation. But I don't expect really to have a good participation, let's say, in this next election we have on June the 7th.
If you were to pick a percentage for every political party, what do you expect and what does that mean? What do you expect the PAN to get, the PRD to get, the PRI to get? How do you see, especially because there are 10 political parties participating, how do you see the voters splitting their vote?
Well, it's difficult to predict.
Sure.
What the polls show, it's not my prediction, is that the PRI is around 30-31%. PAN should get about 24%. PRD maybe 16-17. Morena, one of the new parties, about 10%. And all the other ones with lower voting. And I think that's more or less what public opinion is expecting of this new election, that the major fractions in the next Congress will be the PRI and the PANs, and that the others will keep more or less what they have at this moment.
Is this fractioning of the vote in Congress good for Mexican democracy, or is it bad for Mexican democracy? How do you read the fact that Mexicans do not seem to be able to achieve a political consensus to either go right or left, but rather are pretty divided in their political choices?
Well, what I see in this election, Tony, is that we will have what we call the hard vote of every party, the people who always votes for the same party, and that people who one time votes for this side or the other side will not vote, or will vote very low in this occasion. I think that what is lacking in this election is proposals. We don't have proposals from any party and from any candidate. They just say, I'm the best, so you should believe me and vote for me or vote for my party. But we don't have real proposals on what changes or what project they're trying to implement in Mexico, or what project they're trying to push on in Mexico. And I think this is a very important falla. You can translate
Failure, yeah.
Failure in this election.
Yeah. So tell me, why is it that the institutions that you mentioned in your presentation, the military, the presidency, and all the institutions have such low credibility? And tell me a little bit about what you think, or why you think the INE in particular, this is the National Electoral Institute, which organizes the elections in Mexico, has such low legitimacy and credibility. What is going on at the INE that most Mexicans are skeptical? And it's a skepticism that was not experienced by IFE. So something happened in the transition between that electoral system to the new electoral system that drove the INE to such low numbers in the polls, in approval ratings.
I think INE is having the impact of discredit that is impacting every institution right now in Mexico. And I think that it was a wrong measure to centralize electoral authority in a national authority and not leaving the state electoral authorities. We were with the perception that decentralizing was a good measure and not centralizing. And I think this has an impact on what people is perceiving of INE. On the other hand, the discredit of the institutional discredit, I would say, of the Supreme Court and the government and the executive and chamber, the Congress, etc. I think it's in part related with corruption, with impunity, and people sees that all these institutions, the people who are heading the most important officials in these institutions, well, in some way or another, they are involved in corruption affairs, or they don't comply with the Estado de Derecho.
The rule of law.
The rule of law, that's it.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about the institutions. You Clearly, institutions that were previously untouched by this lack of approval in the general ratings, such as the military, the church, and the INE, then IFE, and the Supreme Court are now, why is it that they're now so unpopular? What happened to these institutions over the last few years that they themselves also fell in the approval ratings of the Mexican citizens?
Well, you should have to go to, I would say, particular cases in every, regarding every institution. For example, the Supreme Court. There was a wide demand for a consultation on the energy reform, which was backed by 7 million people who had asked the authorities to call for this consultation.
A referendum. So.
A referendum. And finally, the Supreme Court ruled that this consultation was related to income policies, to fiscal policies, which was never, I would say it was never the case. And this, I think, was the last, the drop that came.
The straw that broke the camel's back.
That's it.
Yes. You can read his thoughts for some reason.
Other institutions, I would say, are in one way or another involved or in breaking the rule of law, or with high-ranked officials related with some corruption affairs.
Is this election a referendum on the Peña administration?
Maybe it could be considered as such. I wouldn't say so, because if most of people are not voting, I wouldn't say that this is a real referendum on the Peña administration. But if you make any kind of poll, any kind of consultation to public opinion, a serious one, you will find that the Peña government is highly discredited, and people sees this government as if it were in its final days, and we're only not still at the half of the term. We're only over the first third of the term, and everybody would be thinking that we are in the last moments of this government, that it will be going in a few months. That's not the case.
In the United States, generally, we see a midterm election as a poll on the presidency itself. Mm-hmm. So you're not convinced that this is going to be that kind of poll on the Peña administration's performance. You think that Mexicans will separate those two things and vote for Congress independently of what they think of the Peña administration?
Yes, and particularly because in this election, what we will have is the hard vote of every party, and not a massive participation. Our high participations in past elections should be around 60% of the total citizenship. But in this case, maybe we will have about 30%, and that's more or less the hard vote of every party.
Tell me a little bit about the PRI. How does the PRI go into this election in the perception of Mexican voters? And by the way, I will ask you the same thing of the PAN and the PRD and Morena and the Partido Verde, or the Green Party.
Well, I would say that people are considering every party as in some way as a corrupt institutions, be it true or not. And they have, I would say, little attraction to participate or to support those parties. But they have their hard vote, as I was saying before. They have the hard vote, and this vote will always be participating in the election. And I would say this is the same for the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD. Morena, I don't know what the response in this election will be to this new party. And the other parties will have a very small vote, So it's difficult to really give an opinion of what we would call the small parties. Maybe if 10 parties are participating in this election, maybe 2 or even 3 could lose their registration if they don't get the 3% of the vote.
Tell me, looking into your soul, why exactly did you leave the PRD?
Well, publicly I had asked for changes, especially in the internal policies of the party. I had done this 2 years or 3 years ago, maybe some years back, then a few months before. But when I finally saw that this was not going to change, well, I had to make a decision. Or I share the responsibilities, or I don't share the responsibilities. And that's when I decided to leave the party.
Mm-hmm. What's your relationship with Mr. López Obrador, and would you support, even if you're not a member of, I don't believe you're a member of Morena, but even if you're not, do you think that that's a party that keeps a promise that has somehow a good chance at helping change Mexico in the future? How do you view Morena as a whole?
I think Morena has been mainly proposing, or its main proposal is to combat corruption. But there is no other, that's the only proposal. I don't see a national project. I don't see what kind of policies would be implemented if Morena really arrived to power. So my relationship with López Obrador is a good personal relationship, but we meet and see each other very seldom. And well, I wouldn't vote for Morena.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, why is it that the Mexican left has not been able to present a project before Mexican voters? I was somewhat puzzled by the splintering of the left once again, so that they cannot somehow coalesce and present a national project, or at least a counterweight, a checks and balances type of project vis-a-vis the right, which has governed Mexico through the pre and the pan. They're both on the right. Why has the left not been able to do that?
Well, I think that personal interests have prevailed over collective or even party interests. And I think the corruption in some way is also present in this division of the left. I think that's a reality, and if this doesn't change, people won't be attracted attracted by the different parties that we could consider in the left, even if we don't know what left means for one or the other.
What are the lefts that exist in Mexico? I know that there is a European-style modern left, and then there is a populist Latin American-style left. Where is the left in Mexico in this spectrum from the modern left to the populist left? How do you assess the value of the left in Mexico?
Well, if you take into consideration the proposals we are hearing about in this campaign, you would say that pre-PAN and PRD are more or less the same. You won't find a real difference between the different parties. Not on the left, not on the right, not on the center. They're not proposing nothing. So that's what I would say.
Are you worried about the electoral violence that we've seen in Mexico lately? Several candidates have been assassinated. The different party members are fighting in the streets occasionally. There's a little bit of electoral violence here and there. Is that a worrisome sign? Is that a sign of something to come? Or are you not concerned about that? I'm
not concerned. I'm not worried of what has happened in the case of violence in this election. I think that the cases of assassination we've known about are related with previous events and not with the election itself. I think that the election or the campaigns have nothing to do, no relation with the assassinations itself.
Do you think that there will be a continual use of public funds to direct the vote in Mexico by certain political parties, that they will continue to use public resources to do that? Can Mexico ever eradicate this kind of electoral corruption?
I think that's the main point and should be the main objective of a real electoral reform. How to stop this money that is illegal in our elections. I think that this will reduce, this is reducing in some way, because there are many, there's a stronger observation, and public opinion is against these practices, but still candidates and parties find the way to put this illegal money on campaigns. And I think it's very difficult, if not to detect, to prove the origin of these funds.
There's two kinds of sources of illegal monies in campaigns. One is the embezzling of public funds, and the other one is obviously organized crime. Do you see organized crime as a serious threat to the credibility of these elections? And I ask this question because this is a question that I get asked often by those who are interested in Mexico, at least in Houston or Texas.
You won't find, I think that you won't find money of organized crime in the federal election, but you will find this kind of money in some, and I would emphasize some, municipal elections, where organized crime is controlling different territories in the country, in particular certain municipalities. And there, I think, we will have the money and the influence of organized crime, but in specific or places, not in the general election, and not as not financing the national parties, but candidates for municipal positions.
In the last few weeks, we have seen a rather big scandal that surrounds the Green Party in Mexico. Can you explain the Green Party for us and what is going on there and why the scandal around that particular political party?
Well, the Green Party is, I would call it a franchise, not a real political party. And what I think is that they have calculated if they're to be multados, fined, if they're going to be fined, and their publicity has brought important support to this party. There's an estimate that they may get maybe 6-7% of the votes, and that's very high for the kind of party the Green Party is. And I think it's that they are orienting their publicity to certain points where people think they really can make the change that they're offering. And they are spending lots of money, even if they know they will be fined by the federal authority by doing so. So this is a calculated, this is calculated in their budget, the funds they receive from the government, the subsidy they receive from the government, and this is calculated for them, the fines they will get.
I know the Senate will remain divided because the Senate is a six-year term, but the House will change. What does a House with 6 or 7 political parties represented, none of them having a majority, mean for the reforms that were passed in the first half of the Peña administration? Is Congress going to be in the way? Is it going to change, reverse? How do you see Congress interacting in the next 3 years with the administration and its intention to implement the reforms?
I think the Congress will be acting with the government, because the composition of the next chamber will be, I think, very much like the one we have now, with the PRI and PAN as the major fractions. Maybe the PRI could be an absolute majority with the Green Party, maybe, but I don't see that they will change. They won't be looking to reverse any of these reforms, maybe some minor changes, and I don't see that the Congress or the chamber will be an important instrument to implement the reforms. I think the government is, for one reason or the other, I don't find exactly which, is incapable or hasn't the will to implement fully these reforms.
You gave us a little bit of a historical account of what has happened in Mexico in the 1980s, a little bit in the 90s, and the 21st century. Mexico's democratic transition has obviously been one of the longest, if not the longest, in the world. 35 years, 40 years, perhaps if you go back to 1968, or the democratic movement inside the PRI when you were a member of that party. Why is Mexico having such a difficult time finally exiting the transition period and entering the consolidation period?
Well, I think that interests opposed going against a real deep reform have prevailed in Mexico. I wouldn't find any other explanation. And these interests are very closely related with corruption affairs since time back.
We'll open it up to a few questions. You can stand in the aisles and please coming up to the aisle. Yeah, just coming up to either side, and we'll do that. We'll take some questions. Please go ahead.
Ingeniero, thanks for being here and for your presentation. Recent scandals in Brazil have shown us that unfortunately there's no party that is exempted from the disease of corruption. However, there are examples also in Latin America that show us success, such as Uruguay or Chile, where this has been reduced dramatically. Which do you think is the responsibility of the government and also of the civil society in Mexico to ensure corruption reaches something that is manageable? Because obviously corruption is a problem of the society. It's not really a problem of the government solely. It's embedded in the society. So which should be the responsibility of the society to fight against corruption in the country?
Well, I think that right now in Mexico, there's been a collective consciousness that corruption is the major problem the country is facing. And I would expect that the people would organize to really demand real action from the authorities in general, not only the government, but the authorities in general, to fight and eradicate corruption. If the people does not organize, I don't think that there will be an important change. But I think people is beginning to become more and more conscious that by participating, by denouncing, things may change. But a vast organization and a plural organization is needed to really change this condition.
One of the latest laws, to follow up on that question, was recently the Mexican Congress passed the anti-corruption system, a series of laws and mechanisms that are designed to check corruption in Mexico. Will it work?
If there's no political will at the top of the government, that's the executive, the Supreme Court, the Congress, it will be very difficult. I don't think that you have to start fighting corruption by sweeping, like you sweep the staircase from up down. And I don't see at this moment the political will in the highest ranked authorities.
What would political will look like? What actions would you say would be an affirmation that there is finally political will to do that?
Well, there are public cases, or cases that have been made public of corruption of high-ranked officials or people very close to high-ranked officials. Not only in this administration, we can go back several administrations. There's the case of Oceanografía, there's the case of the sons of Marta Sagún, there's now the case of the Casablanca and OHL, this construction company. And if we don't see real action against those involved in corruption activities, well, we cannot think that any system, even if it's approved by Congress or established by law, will be effective.
Steve.
Steven Zamora, University of Houston. I want to congratulate the Baker Center or the Baker Institute and the Mexico Center for bringing you here, Mr. Cárdenas. It's an honor to have you in Houston. You've had such a positive impact on democracy in Mexico, which is a process that continues. And not only that, you are the son of one of the most revered presidents of Mexico who helped liberate Mexico from the oil companies, depending on your view of that. And my question is, do you think that the recent energy reforms in Mexico were inevitable? And if so, or whether or not you do, how do you see this process unfolding? Do you see it? That's a very broad question to make, but basically, is it inevitable, and are you positive towards the eventual outcome of energy reforms in Mexico?
Well, I think that an energy reform was necessary and inevitable, but not this reform. I think that a major change in energy policies was necessary to give fiscal and administrative autonomy to Pemex, for example, to have a different policy regarding exploration and reserves, to have a much better relationship between exploitation and reserves. So we could have reserves not for 8 years or 9 years as we have now, but for 30 or 40 years as we had just 10 or 15 years ago. That corruption had to be fought and eradicated from Pemex and other state entities. That Mexico should begin reducing the export of crude oil and transform it in Mexico mainly through petrochemical industry. I think that these were the most important changes to be made. And for example, what we are seeing now, that Pemex is changing from a state organism to a public productive enterprise. Well, it continues to depend from the Ministry of Finance, from the Secretaría de Hacienda. Finance is deciding energy policy and oil policy and prices of derivatives of oil. And we are, the government has established certain goals. For example, that Mexico will be producing 3 million barrels a day in 2018 and 3.5 millions in 2025. And we are in a declining situation of our deposits. So it's impossible to meet those goals if things don't change with the exploration policy. And I don't think that by delivering decisions regarding our subsoil resources to private industry and considering that oil and electricity are not strategic sectors will be beneficial for Mexico. I think we're going backwards. We're losing the capacity to make decisions regarding the national interests. And I think this reform was not only unnecessary, but will have negative effects, and that a reform of energy policies was really necessary, but not this reform.
Yes, Sissy Farenthold from Houston. You've had 20 years, and I'd like to hear what your opinion is, what the report card would be on NAFTA from the Mexican viewpoint aspect.
Well, I think NAFTA has positive effects in certain areas, but it was, I would say, a treaty, an agreement, not well negotiated, not from the side of Mexico. For example, we opened our agricultural sector with haste and not considering what the effects would be, and now we have I would say, a disaster in our agriculture, especially in those areas that are not the most productive from the agricultural point of view. We have abandoned all kind of policy to improve production conditions in our rural areas, and I think that in this way NAFTA was not possible. Even if we have tripled or more than tripled our exports, mainly on certain products like auto industry. But for example, before NAFTA, Mexican inputs in our exports were of about 80%. After NAFTA, right now, Mexican inputs in our exports must be around 20%. So this means that we have passed through the industrialization process. We have lost industries, we have reduced other important branches of industry, and but this, I won't say that responsibility is on NAFTA, but that Mexico did not decide, did not implement internal policies to profit from NAFTA. We could have profited from NAFTA and have a condition, but since NAFTA was implemented, or even before NAFTA was being discussed, we had lost impulse, and our economy was growing very slowly regarding the previous in long time period from, let's say, 1930 to 1980. After the 80s, we have had a very slow growth, and I wouldn't say that NAFTA is responsible, but the lack of internal economic policies is what causes these results.
Thank you. Here.
Hello, Ingeniero. I'm Pablo Preciado. I'm a Mexican lawyer. I practice energy law. My question here is regarding the democratic procedure that we are right now living in Mexico. Every thread of the social, political, and economical composition of Mexico, it's not only in doubt, but has been very shredded. It has been treated really bad, and right now Mexicans trust very little governmental institutions, like our Banco de Mexico, the federal bank. It's like a respected institution. Out of it, I am having a hard time like finding some institution that I can believe in. Other problem is that it's not only on the government, it's also on the party side. Left was supposed to be a really strong, united front of Mexican democracy. During the last years, with all the Abarca problems, the Ayotzinapa issues, and the rising of Morena, they have torn apart completely. And the people that are like getting fun with Morena are getting for because of what you were telling previously about the hard vote. But PRD, it's completely divided. It has really low credibility at all. Even inside Mexico City, right now there's like this feeling that it will probably be the first election that they lose inside. Well, not now, but when the term is due, that they will lose the city. Also, socially, we are really bad. We have like these social movements that have good means, but the way they are performing it have become them completely bad. I'm talking precisely about the Marcha por la Paz that was against the Ayotzinapa matters. It ended burning a door that was from the 15th, 16th century. Like, how can we believe in our social movements if they act with violence?
Thank you.
My question is, how can Mexicans believe that democracy is available and it's approachable if we have nowhere to go?
Thank you.
Well, I think we have somewhere to go if we decide to do it, but not necessarily following or joining any of the, I would say, the existing political parties. I think we have to think of citizen organizations, civil organizations, and trying to congregate around another national proposal. I don't think that the proposals of any of the political parties or the government or civil institutions or business, high business institutions could lead any real change in Mexico. I think that this has to be people organizing, and that will take, if it really starts, that will take a long time. It's not easy to go against the prevailing interests, economic interests mainly, national and international, that are acting or that have an impact on Mexican situation.
In this election, we're looking at the possibility that Nuevo León may elect an independent candidate. Is that where a national project, a set of public policies that make sense may come from independent candidates, or are those just a red herring of sorts? How do you view a potential election of an independent candidate in such an important state?
I think that in the first place that we should have a much not so complicated procedure to have independent candidates. It's very complicated. It's very hard. It takes much time. It's harder than the election itself. And I think that this should change if we really want to benefit of the possibility of independent candidates. In the case of Nuevo León, I really don't know what this independent candidate is proposing. I don't know if he's really committed with fighting corruption or what kind of changes is he proposing to push, to bring about. But I think it's an important participation, and it will be a very important antecedent to any other possibilities in the future. And this may bring, I would expect, changes that would facilitate the registration of independent candidates. That's an important part of our electoral reform to be made.
Licenciado Cárdenas, bienvenido a Houston. My name is Flor Di Masi, and I'm originally from Torreón, Coahuila, Mexico. And I have the following question for you. With the advent of the Mexican energy reform, how is the Mexican educational system getting ready to supply the much-needed engineering candidates to support Mexico's growth infrastructure?
Well, I don't think that any official policy is being implemented to support these reforms. Not the energy reform, not any other reform. So I don't see how this could be supported by Mexican technicians, Mexican technology, Mexican science. I don't see the interest of the government to coordinate these reforms with other kind of policies, be it educational or job creation, etc.
So what do you think is going to happen?
I think that if, in the first place, I don't think that the goals that the government has established for energy reform, 3 million barrels a day in 2018 to 3.5 in 2025 will be met. I think we're in a declining situation, and I don't see any will in the government to really change our energy and particularly oil policy. And I don't see any measure being taken to really support this reform with Mexican technicians.
Thank
Over
you.
here, thank you.
Tanya Pignon, I'm a student at Rice University. My question is, you previously mentioned that the current scandals will not necessarily be reflected in the upcoming elections, but do you believe that the newly elected pre-officials will continue to defend the Peña Nieto administration, or do you think that they will begin to be more concerned with defending the party rather than the current president?
Well, I think they will continue supporting the Peña Nieto administration and doing mainly what the Peña Nieto administration proposes.
Is presidentialism in Mexico dead, or is it alive and kicking?
I don't know if it's kicking, but it's alive.
Right. Yes. Last two questions right here. Yes.
My name is Edgar Vargas. I'm actually from close to Torreón, Coahuila, born in Mexico, raised in the United States. My question is fairly simple. It's been about 100 years, and since the last constitution, Mexico has had pretty much consistent corruption, low social mobility, low GDP growth, and compared to the other two countries in NAFTA, relatively low performance. Do you think it is time for constitutional reform, or is our current framework sufficient for Mexico to actually grow?
Well, I think that we have to think of reforms in our constitution if there is a different project, a different national model to be implemented. This could mean constitutional changes, but not just promote discussion and change of the constitution for change itself. We must know what changes should mean, and if constitutional reforms are necessary or not.
Well, specifically land rights and human rights, the ability of people to be innocent before proven guilty, owning piece of parcel, owning the land and mineral wealth underneath, a lot of these are what I've seen as affecting personal development and growth, and essentially supporting the lack of social mobility. Without something to fight for or something to lose, we see a lot of elections basically as who do I support, not so much who defends me. And in that case, that's one of the challenges that I've seen as an American-born or Mexican-born American that I see in Mexico, and I'd like to just get your thoughts further on that.
Thank you.
Well, I think that I didn't get exactly this last part of the question.
Is the current economic framework under which we operate enough to eventually get Mexico to take off or something like that? But also, you said something really interesting, which is, would a constitutional reform that would turn Mexico into a place, American style, where people can own their land, but also the mineral rights underneath, like in Texas, where you own the land and you own the mineral rights and you own that, can a different economic model for Mexico than the current model work?
Well, I don't think so, and I don't think that by changing the legislation on the rights to subsoil would be beneficial to Mexico. On the contrary, I think that what we've been losing with this energy reform is the control of our non-renewable and in general the subsoil resources. And I think this has not only to be more open, but has to be reversed. That's my personal point of view. And I think that maybe in the case of human rights, we would have to go particularly on the different rights that could be involved in this concept. Maybe some of them could need some reform or some change in our constitution, but I won't be precise in this answer.
Last question.
Gracias. Buenas noches. Jaime Martínez, originario de aquí de Houston, de ascendencia mexicana. I want to ask you, with the amount of information that is now available to Mexican citizens in terms of access online to different fountains or different sources of information, and the way that this information is quickly transmitted and spread and debated and talked about, how do you see political parties, particularly at the federal level, responding in terms of their campaign strategies?
Well, what I see in this campaign, regardless of this changes in transmission and the speed of transmission, etc., is that they have no proposal. So people doesn't know what the parties are fighting for. It's only to gain personal positions of one candidate or the other. We don't see that if one candidate arrives to the expected position, this will bring necessarily a change in this policy or that policy, be it energy or fiscal or land reform or whatever. We don't see that any party or any candidate really represents a certain change on a certain aspect. That's what we don't see in this particular election.
I have a final question then, and it goes right to the heart of the topic of this conference. What is the state of Mexican democracy today?
We have a better electoral democracy than the one we had before. Vote is correctly counted. That didn't happen before. We have been moving backwards in our social democracy. That's equal opportunities for everybody in the case of education, health, housing, etc. I think we've been moving backwards if we consider also a democracy in the international scene. we are much more dependent on decisions taken outside of Mexico in important economic issues. We are moving backwards, for example, regarding the control of our natural resources. We have to consider that Mexico is not a military power or an economic power and needs to have some strength in its legislation, and this is being reduced, even lost in some cases, but I would say at least reduced. And we've been moving, I would say, we reached a certain point in our electoral democracy. We still have to improve our electoral democracy, but in other aspects of democracy, we've been moving backwards, especially in the last years, not only in this administration, but in the last administrations.
Over the last 2 years of the Mexico Center, we've had a lot of debates on Mexico, public policy, and different issues in this very forum. This is a different and refreshing presentation because most of the conversations surround debates that are pretty mainstream and neoliberal. But I think that all voices need to be heard. Those that come from the left, those that come from the right, those that are looking for alternatives. And it's really been a wonderful conversation. I thank you for coming here and for presenting a very refreshing view, perhaps to make us think about the downsides of the consensus that has prevailed and that we have debated plentifully in this forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to you.
Take a minute and present you with a little gift from